Hello, my name is Laura Jessie Isles, and I work here at Iowa State University in the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic. So I'm the place where people send in, their house plant isn't looking too good and they want to know what's wrong with it, or they've got branches on their trees dying, or, what's this insect that I found, in my house. So all those cool samples and things come to me, and then I help people with how to manage those problems with integrated pest management. So I'm really excited today to talk to you about integrated pest management. And in this presentation, I'm going to give you a really broad overview of integrated pest management and then a few details about how you probably already are using it in your garden and how you can implement it more. So integrated pest management is a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in ways that minimize the economic, health, and environmental risks. So this is kind of a tricky sounding definition, but the whole point is that we want to be able to sustainably manage pests. We want to be able to sustainably have nice plants and food far into the future. And we do it by combining a lot of different tools, and we're always doing that so we're not hopefully not spending more money than we have, that we're protecting our health and the environmental health. So with IPM, we really focus on applying treatments only when we need to. And we also like to use the least disruptive treatment possible. Particularly in the insecticides, sometimes a treatment can kill not only the pest insect, but all of the beneficial insects as well. And so that would be kind of a disruptive treatment. So we want to minimize those negative impacts when we do have to manage our pests. So IPM is a way of managing pest problems by using a variety of methods, and we seek to reduce pesticide use, but we don't get rid of pesticides. Pesticides are a very important tool in the IPM toolbox. IPM is not organic. There is no certification. Organic is a very separate thing with organic certification and very strict regulations on what pesticides can be used. IPM is not that. IPM is usually not about pest eradication. We don't focus on trying to get rid of all the pests, control all the pests, so that pest eradication, pest control are not something that we think about when we're talking about IPM in our gardens, just because the amount of pesticide that we need to use to completely get rid of all pests is too much for an integrated pest management program. Now, when we go indoors, and we're not going to talk about this now, but when we come indoors and say it's bed bugs, then we're focusing more on pest eradication, because no one will say, hey, 2 bed bugs is okay. They just won't. So you have to focus in on pest eradication and pest control. So it kind of depends a little bit on the pest and the location. So who uses IPM? We all do. Gardeners and homeowners use IPM. Farmers are using them in their fields all the time. Landscape professionals use it. Pest control operators, the pest control people that come to your house, they can talk to you about ways to minimize pests coming in addition to using pesticides. Schools, there's IPM in schools programs. So basically everyone is using IPM or can use IPM. Anytime there's a pest, we can use IPM. So what are pests? So pest to me is always an interesting term, because you kind of grow up thinking like, okay, a pest, that's a thing. Like this insect is a pest. This plant is a pest. But it's really it's a human term that we've applied to other organisms. And so each person can have a different opinion about what a pest is, that there's no, definition out there of pest. Basically, a pest is just any organism that is doing something that a human doesn't like. So this is a completely human-centric term. In general, when we're thinking about, garden and landscape integrated pest management, our big pests are going to be the insects, the weeds, the plant diseases, and then sometimes mammals as well, such as, moles. Snakes, of course, very beneficial in some ways. They feed on a lot of those mice and things that can harm plants, but many people consider any snake a pest. So what's a pest to one person may not necessarily be a pest to another person. And of course, I love it when I have tomato hornworms on my tomato, because I grow my plants for the insects. I encourage everyone to become an entomologist, and you too will be growing your plants for the insects and not be as concerned. So the components of IPM, we will have pest prevention, pest monitoring, decision making, treatment, and finally evaluation. And we'll go through each of these individually, but I want you to understand that it's kind of, we have it linear here, but this circles back around. This is kind of a continuous process. And I think one of the problems we all have is that we find we have a pest. We were monitoring, we decided we wanted to make a treatment, we made a treatment, maybe with a pesticide. But after that, do we evaluate it? Do we, go back out and scout and say, did that work? Do I no longer have the insects there? Did I manage the disease? And make notes on that, if it worked or if it didn't work. It's so important to take notes and know what's going on in our yards, in our farms, in any of our places where we're growing plants, so we can constantly be evaluating and then using that information back into our decision-making process. So when we monitor pests, what we want to know is kind of the what, when, where, and how. So the what is basically what are we monitoring. So there's all sorts of different pests out there, and it really helps if you know your yard or your greenhouse or your system and you know what pests are common, in case of a yard, and maybe you know that you get, in this case, powdery mildew in a certain area each year, and you really wanted to, treat it, and so you start to watch for it. And so you know what you're looking for, that what disease, what insect, what weed, so you have that kind of that search image. And then when should you look for them? The when can be time of the year. Some pests and diseases show up early in the year. Some will come midsummer. Some will come late summer. So when during the calendar year, just when during the day. Some pests are only active at night. For example, here the slug damage on a hosta leaf. You're not going to see the slugs at all during the day, but at night you might be lucky enough to see the slugs out feeding on the hosta. So knowing when to look is really important. And then the where, and I kind of use the example of cockroaches. This is not a garden pest, but this is one where if you've ever had cockroaches in your kitchen, like most of us, where to look is not only kind of at night, but also, under the sink, under the refrigerator, where those cockroaches are active. So when we're thinking, in plants, oftentimes the where is underneath leaves. So it's kind of wherever you've seen that pest or that disease before, that's the places where you want to start looking. And then finally the how to actually go about looking for these pests in our yard. Of course, there's lots of monitoring methods. The cliche for insects is that entomologists are all out there with the sweep net trying to capture insects. So that's certainly one way to monitor insects. We don't do that in the ornamental world very often, just because nets are hard on plants as well, because you kind of have to beat the plants with the net to get the insects off. And so most of us are doing the visual survey, like you see the other gentleman doing, is just examining the plant. And that's probably the most common method. It's very powerful, done frequently. If every few days you're out there looking at the plants in your yard or your greenhouse or your field and noticing any problems right away. The key to IPM is to really see problems, see insects, see diseases before they become, huge populations. So catching things early. So that's so important to be out there frequently. And then the decision-making part. So you're out there, you've noticed something, problem with the plant, there's some symptom or sign, there's something going on. So what are you going to do? The first step is to identify the problem. So we always say, test, don't guess. If you aren't sure what the disease is or what the insect is, you can send that to a diagnostic lab here at Iowa State University. There's lots of places you can get help identifying the problem. But before you even start thinking about what you're going to do about it, make sure that you have the problem properly identified. You want to learn the life cycle and behavior of any insect pests. There's certain times where treatment will be more effective or not, and certain control tactics you can use at different times. So learn that life cycle and behavior. You want to understand the disease cycle of plant diseases. Plant diseases in particular very often have a very limited window when management will be effective. So you want to understand what disease you have and if management will be effective, and if so, when to apply that management. And then you want to decide if management is necessary. And that's kind of a decision, again, that each of us get to make. Do I want to take management steps or don't I? So which gets to the question, how many pests are too many? And like I said, this is a decision each of us get to make. The top picture there is a picture of my lawn, and as you can tell, I don't do much lawn management. It's not a big priority to me, and so the fact that I have a lot of broadleaf weeds in my lawn doesn't bother me. This would drive the next person crazy. So it's a decision that you get to make for your own lawn. There's no right and wrong. There's just what works best for you. And, you know, if you want this is pretty much what I would call the lazy person lawn. If you don't want to do any inputs, this is what your lawn will look like. But if you want a lawn that's, you know, pretty much entirely grass and looks great, that takes more work. So you really can't have the case where you have a plant looking just absolutely beautiful, the lawn looking absolutely beautiful without doing anything. Having things look really good oftentimes takes quite a bit of work. Ants are another pest. I'm fine with a few ants in my kitchen. Ants out in the yard are just fine. Other people really are driven crazy if they see one ant in the kitchen. So ants are pretty beneficial. They feed on a lot of insects and things like that, so I'm not too concerned about it. Roses, black spot here on the rose. Again, it doesn't look too attractive, but so again, it depends on why you're growing the roses. Do you need them to look perfect or not? And that will help you determine if it's too many for you and if you need to apply treatment. And how much damage will you tolerate? Again, like there's like kind of how many pests and then that connection of the number of pests to the damage. The top picture here is an apple with sooty blotch fly speck, which doesn't harm the apple at all. This is actually fungi that just sit just on the surface and feed on the wax of the apple. But if you saw this apple at the grocery store, would you purchase this apple? So there's a difference between, you know, how it looks, it doesn't look attractive and people don't pick it up and purchase it, and how it tastes. It tastes just fine. There's no harm to the actual apple itself. The lower picture, a daylily with a little bit of feedy damage from earwigs. You know, is that too much damage or not? Well, if I were planning to take this daylily to the state fair to show it, this would be far too much damage. If it's, you know, in the back corner of my yard and I just like the splash of yellow, then I probably don't care about this much damage. So as decision making, there's no easy answers. There's no one right answer. Everybody gets to kind of have their own answer to this. And so it's also important, as you know, as master gardeners, if you're helping others with their pest problems or helping them make decisions about whether or not to manage or not to take, you know, your opinions about how much damage is too much or too little, or how many pests are too much or too little, and apply it to somebody else. It's really important, you know, when giving advice to talk to that person about what their opinion is, what their needs are, before you kind of apply your opinions to their situation. So if you have a greater tolerance for pests and damage, so you're fine with more pests, more damage, you're going to have less treatment. You're going to have less environmental impact because you're probably not putting out any pesticides. You're going to have a lower cost of control. Plus, I spent $0 on my lawn. I mowed it. That was all I did on it. But if I wanted it to look nice, I should have been doing, you know, aeration, fertility treatments, probably come in with broadleaf weed control, all sorts of things. So if you tolerate things with lots of pests and some damage, then you can be pretty lazy gardener. That's how I like to be. But again, that's my garden, so it's only for my personal enjoyment, so that makes my decision quite a bit easier. It's definitely a very different situation when you're working with others, and we'll get to that in a minute. So if there's a lower tolerance for pests and damage, so you don't want as many insects or diseases around, you don't want the damage to your plants, you're going to have to apply more treatments. there might be more environmental impact, and there's probably going to be some sort of cost to treatment. So it's a real give and take there. There's no happy place where you can have, no damage and no treatments. So now we'll talk about some kind of terms that we use in integrated pest management. And just so when you're reading about integrated pest management, you understand what these mean. So we first have the injury level. And the injury level is the size of a pest population that causes intolerable damage. Again, that term intolerable, as you can see, that doesn't say anything. This doesn't even say, it just means that the damage is more than you can tolerate. So that brings us to the economic injury level, which is one that, most of us kind of function in, and that's a pest population that causes loss of money. So the loss of money is what's intolerable for these economic injury levels. And so these are very common in agriculture, date back to 1959. So this economic injury level, it's just, they can connect the number of, you have a certain populations of, say, soybean aphids, the cost to treat, which will change each year. There's a certain cost to treatment, and then a certain amount of yield loss that will occur from these populations, and then how much soybeans are worth at the time. And these are all things, the economics, the numbers that go into these models and help growers make decisions about whether or not to treat or not, which differs a little bit from the aesthetic injury level. And this is the area where most of us gardeners, greenhouse, ornamental growers are functioning in. So this is a pest population that causes loss of beauty. So the intolerable here is about loss of beauty. This loss of beauty can then be connected to the economics if you're trying to sell these plants and the plant health is fine. The apple tree is fine even with some Japanese beetle feeding damage on it, but it's not as attractive, and if people don't purchase it, now you have an economic loss. So this is the area that we work in kind of with gardens and landscapes. And certainly this aesthetic injury level, even though it's not going to kill the plant, it's not going to reduce yield, it is enough damage to justify control. So in your group, I want you to kind of think a little bit and talk to your partners and as a group about who determines how many pests are too many in a cornfield for sweet corn and finally for flowers. So I'll let you pause the tape now, spend a few minutes discussing this. After you've discussed it as a group, you can resume the recording. So I hope you had some good discussions. So who determines how many pests are too many? A cornfield. So most corn in Iowa is going very often into high fructose corn syrup and ethanol as animal feed. And so you and I are really not encountering the corn directly that's grown all around us. So the people making determinations are the farmer, possibly the crop consultant, the consumers. Those of us who are consuming that are not, we don't directly buy field corn, so we don't have any influence over those decisions in general. The farmers making the decisions that are best for the environment and for the economics of the farm, which is kind of different in the case of sweet corn. And hopefully you guys discuss this and discuss, like, obviously the farmer is getting to make their decisions. I mean, they're ultimately applying any pesticides if they think there are pests too many. But as a consumer, we get to have a big influence over that, because if we buy sweet corn and it's got, quite a few corn earworms in it, we might not buy from that person again. So we're getting to have a direct influence over what that grower is doing in order to maintain, their sales and things like that. And then flowers, that's another one where, again, just like flowers in my own yard, I can make those decisions for myself about how much damage I'll tolerate, how many pests I'll tolerate. But if I'm trying to sell those flowers, then again, that consumer will have a huge influence about how much damage is tolerable. And consumers, especially, when they have a choice, there's a whole, flat of plants there, of course they're going to pick out the perfect ones. And so the ones that are damaged, even though it's just a little bit of leaf damage and it's probably not hurting the plant, when people have choices, they won't purchase those, and then you have an economic loss there. So when we consider injury levels, we want to consider things like the value of the plant, the value of the crop that we're trying to get. We're growing apples. What's the fresh market value of apples? What'll be the cost of management? If the cost of management is worth more than the value of the crop, then it's not good to do any management because you just lost money on it. So the management cost has to be less than the value of the crop. The potential loss from lack of control. Will you no longer can fresh market your apples, you have to use them in cider, and you've lost a lot of money that way. So what's the amount of loss? How susceptible to injury is this plant? Is it, late in the season and maybe a little bit of injury isn't too bad? Maybe we're to the point where, the yields are kind of set and a little bit of feeding injury isn't going to reduce yields. So that all depends kind of on the plant throughout the growing season, how susceptible it is to injury. Obviously, you plant a new little seedling out there and it's got 3 leaves, it's very susceptible to injury. It only has 3 leaves. Once that plant is much larger, a little bit of feeding injury is not as harmful to it. So that gets to those considerations. Just like I mentioned, the age of the plant. Plants that are new to a site may suffer greater damage than established plants. So as they come in new, they're trying to get established. Oftentimes they're stressed. They can suffer greater damage and it's more harmful to them. Just overall plant health and vigor can have a huge impact on how much injury. And then the time of the year. Is it early in the year, late in the year? Things like broadleaf trees lose their leaves late in the year. So we're not too concerned about injury to leaves late in the year. So decision making. So again, the less injury tolerated, the lower the threshold, and the fewer control options will be available. So kind of keep that in mind. We're going to go through the control options now, and you get more limited in the control options that you have depending on how much injury you're willing to tolerate. So we want to look at kind of how we prevent or manage pests. And so within IPM, we have the 4 main ways. We have cultural controls, mechanical controls, biological controls, and chemical controls. All of these work together. You don't do just kind of one of these, pick your management option. No, almost all IPM-based management are use of several of these different control options. It depends on the pest. It depends on the plant. So we'll go through each one. So first of all, cultural controls. And to me, in my head, I define this as just like it's easier to prevent a problem than solve it. So cultural controls are all about making sure there's no pest problem to even start with. So we do lots of things to prevent problems. And this is where you as gardeners and growers you've got this one down pat because you're always doing things to prevent problems. You're keeping your plants healthy, keeping them in good health with water, fertilizer. You're selecting the right plants. You're selecting plants that will match your site. You're selecting resistant varieties when available. You can do things like crop rotation, sanitation, particularly things like tomatoes that can have buildups of disease over the years. Rotating away from any potato or potato relative is very important, and certainly cleaning up crop debris where insects and diseases can overwinter really helps. So these are just things that you're doing to help the plants stay healthy. You're also making decisions, not only the plant selection, you're also making decisions about, what sort of fertility you're going to use. You're making sure that you're planting the plants properly, that you're providing them enough water. So all these things so important to that plant health. And healthy plants can really fight back against the diseases and insects. We are so often see the worst problems on plants that are already stressed. And you want to plant the right plant for the area. So again, you would plant hostas in an area that's shaded. And then always kind of keep in mind that if something changes about the area, you might see problems. We very often get samples of, hostas with sunburn. And, we say, okay, this looks like sunburn, not a disease or insect problem. And the person's like, oh, I had some honeysuckles over that and they got old and I removed them. And, they are getting a lot more sun all of a sudden after I removed that, honeysuckle in July. So, you always kind of have to be, when you're kind of looking at plants and trying to solve these problems, always be keeping in mind of kind of what's the history of the area, because sometimes it was the right plant for the right area at the time, and if things have changed, it may no longer be so. Another important thing to do is use mulch. Mulch prevents weeds, so weeds really compete strongly with trees and other plants for water. So if you use mulch, you're going to reduce water loss from the soil. And the big thing is also it keeps lawnmowers and weed trimmers away from the trunk of the tree, especially in small trees and even large trees. They're so vulnerable to even minor damage to the trunk. It's so important to keep those weed trimmers and mowers away. So now I want you to kind of discuss with your neighbor a cultural control you have used in your garden, and what pests were you trying to prevent with those things. So you can pause now, discuss this amongst yourselves, and then after you've kind of discussed it and shared some different things that different people are doing and hopefully learned some things yourself, you can press play again and resume this presentation. Okay, I hope you learned some great ways to use some of those cultural controls to prevent pests in your yard, and I hope you realized you're already doing a lot of those things. So cultural controls are all about preventing, keeping the plants healthy, preventing problems. Now we're going to move into the mechanical controls, and this is where we're looking. We've caught the pest, and we know it's there, but we're trying to keep it away from the house, keep it away from the plants. So we're trying to keep it away from us. So these are similar to the cultural controls, but we focus less on plant health and more about how we can physically keep that pest away from our plants. Mechanical controls are primarily for insects and weeds and mammals. We don't really have mechanical control options for the plant diseases, just because it's very hard to keep spores off your plants. So probably our most useful mechanical control is simply picking pests off a plant. If you've got a small number of plants and you're out there examining your plants and you see a pest insect, you see a caterpillar feeding, pick it off and toss it away. Caterpillars aren't that smart. They're not going to crawl across the whole lawn and find your plant again. So picking them off the plant is very useful. Even if you think you're going to come back in with an insecticide, insecticides are never, 100%. It really helps to remove some of those plant or pests if you can before applying other controls. Things like scale insects can be removed by pruning and other options. Netting is a very useful tool. Netting keeps pests off the plant. These are row covers. You can purchase these in most garden catalogs. And these are really beneficial, especially to, when you're transplanting out small plants in the spring, because it functions like a small greenhouse and keeps plants protected from the wind and, keeps them a little warmer. So they provide benefits to plant health, and then they just physically keep those pests away from the plants early in the season when they're so vulnerable. We're using these for cucurbits, so melons, which are so vulnerable to the striped and spotted cucumber beetle when you first transplant them out there, and so this protects them. You can remove these row covers if it's a plant that needs bee pollination. You can remove those row covers at flowering time. You can very often reuse them. You can see in the picture here we've buried the edges with soil, but you can also use, people use like hoses filled with water to weight it down. Bags filled with smooth rocks so they don't, rip that that material, because it's kind of like a thick dryer sheet, that material. So you can use kind of anything to weight it down, and then things that you can, fold back off and water the plants and put them back down. So if you're not using, row covers, I really encourage you to implement them into your gardening. They're a very cost-effective way to protect plants early in the season. And again, pruning, if you've got scale insects and they're really heavy on one branch of the tree, just removing that tree, or removing that, you can remove the tree too, but you got to have a lot of scales all over the tree. Trust me, I see trees where I'm like, okay, single pruning cut to the base is probably your best option. But no, in this case, if you're wanting to save the tree and it just seems to be one branch that, has died or has wood-boring insects in it, just removing that branch and destroying it is an effective control option. There are vacuum devices, and in greenhouses and things like that, sometimes air movement is used to dislodge pests, particularly pests that are, have wings like thrips and things like that. It's not one that's commonly used in the home garden. I think most of us use things like the mechanical control of vacuuming in our own homes against, the lady beetles and other insect pests like that. So the next, once we move, we've kind of tried to prevent the pests from happening with our cultural controls. Mechanical controls we had to try to just keep them away from our plants. Now we move into the biological controls, which is using kind of nature against nature. So we're using what nature gave us. We're using those natural enemies, those insect predators or parasites that eat pest insects or weeds, and also the insect pathogens, those diseases that kill pest insects. So predators are going to be larger and more active than the prey, and they're going to eat more than one pest insect. So predators will consume a lot of different pests in order to complete their development. For example, lady beetle larvae will typically consume 200 or 300 aphids before they become adults. The adult lady beetle will also consume aphids, and they also feed on pollen and nectar, like the picture here in the flower. Ladybug and lady beetle are kind of the same things. Ladybug is always written as one word because it's not really a bug. There's a group of insects called the true bugs, so whenever we write ladybug, we make it one word like that, and then entomologists, we like to just say lady beetle because it's actually a beetle, and when you write out lady beetle, it's actually two words, so lady and then beetle separately. So it's a little bit of insect naming trivia for you today. And then you can see down the other corner the lacewing larva and then the ladybug larva. So you probably have seen those in your garden. You just may not have realized what they were and how beneficial they are by feeding on all those garden pests that you have. And then the parasites. So the parasites are going to be smaller than the host. That's their food source. And they generally live on or in the host. You can see here on the caterpillar the arrow pointing to that small kind of white object. That's the egg of a parasitic fly. So the female fly flew up to the caterpillar. She basically glued her egg on the side of the caterpillar, and then when her larva, maggot, hatches, it'll just hatch out right through the side of the egg, right through the cuticle, the skin of the caterpillar, and go right into the caterpillar's body, where the maggot will feed on the caterpillar until it completes development. The maggots are very good at not consuming the vital parts of the caterpillar, so they're not going to eat the nervous system or the heart or the digestive system. They basically eat all the non-essential parts first, and then when they're close to development being completed, then they'll finish up by eating all the essential parts of the caterpillar and killing it at that point. So parasites are very often tiny wasps and flies growing in or on that host, and they eventually will kill the host. Another term you'll sometimes hear is parasitoid. Parasitoid tends to be used more often by entomologists. So if you see that term parasitoid, it also just means these small wasps and flies that are going to kill the host. This is a parasitic wasp that parasitizes aphids. And one of my favorites, very common outdoors, if you have a colony of aphids on your plants, I encourage you just to leave the aphids and observe all the things going on. So you can see in the bottom picture here the female, and she approaches the aphid and she curls her abdomen underneath herself and lays an egg on that aphid. And she actually can, touches the aphid with her antenna, can make sure that there's not already an egg or a wasp larva inside it, and then it's a good place for her to lay her egg. You can see in the top picture there over on the left-hand side, there's a wasp. You can kind of see at the edge of the leaf there, who's also laying eggs in this group of aphids. And you can see the aphids that are kind of smooth and kind of bronzy colored. Those are actually called aphid mummies. So those are aphids that have had a wasp larva inside it, and they form the pupa, and then the tiny wasp will emerge just right from inside the aphid, and you'll see a tiny little hole in the back of the aphid when the adult wasp emerges. So, and you can just see in the diagram there that basic life cycle of the wasp laying her egg in the aphid. The maggot the larva feeding inside the aphid, and then emerging into the adult wasp. And then the tomato hornworm parasite. The white things that you see are actually pupa and not eggs. So if those were eggs, those would actually be very large eggs for an insect. So most insect eggs are pretty small and hard to see. So these are actually the pupa of the wasp. And you can see there in the top picture an adult wasp coming out of the caterpillar there. So if you've had tomatoes and hornworms, this is a really common one to see. And this is a case where there's obviously lots of larvae feeding in the caterpillar at the same time. So they're all in there feeding. And then when they're done, they emerge through the cuticle, the skin, and then form their pupa and are just basically carried around by the caterpillar. The caterpillar at this point is still alive, but it's not going to pupate at all, and it won't become an adult caterpillar at all. So it's an effective control method, but not too much fun for the caterpillar is my guess. And then finally the pathogens. So insects get diseases too, just like all animals do. So they get diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, fungi, and nematodes. So these 4 different pathogens will infect almost all animals that there are. They'll weaken or kill the pests. And very often these can be used like an insecticide if you've ever used Dipel. Dipel is kind of a brand name of Bt thuringiensis, which is a bacteria that controls Lepidopteran pests. So you may have been using some of these and not realized it at all, but they're out there, and they're probably one of the most important kind of regulators of insect populations. We don't tend to see them or be aware of them, but they're really helping control insect pest populations. And in garden situations, so we really focus on preserving the natural enemies that are already there. It's not cost effective to be releasing these biological control agents, things like the lady beetles that you can buy, and it's fun. You can open the container and all these lady beetles fly out, but trust me, they fly out and they fly away, and they don't really provide any control for your garden. So it can be a fun thing, and especially a fun thing to do with kids, but it's not something that's going to be actually controlling the pests in your garden. So we really focus on kind of preserving the natural enemies that are already there. You want to have a pest reservoir. They need to have food. You can't kind of release them before there's pests at all. And also it's important probably simply to just grow plants that attract natural enemies. There's lots of lists out there of pollinator plants and beneficial plants, and oftentimes they're very much the same because adult parasitic wasps feed on pollen and nectar. Lady beetles need pollen and nectar. It's a very important protein source for them. So having those flowering plants benefits not only the pollinating insects, but all those beneficial insects that are helping control the pests in your yard. And it's also really important just to reduce pesticide use. Pesticides tend to be hard on all those beneficial insects. You can use pesticides on aphids, and you don't get all of them and they bounce right back. And if you've ever had aphids, you know how quickly they can reproduce. Well, aphids are really able to do that, but the lady beetle feeding on those aphids is not able to reproduce so quickly. So when you kill off the lady beetle larva, it takes a long time for a lady beetle adult to decide to come to that area again and lay eggs, and for those eggs to hatch several days later into larvae that start feeding on your aphids. So very often with biological control, sometimes we have, pesticide used that makes the problem worse because it doesn't kill all the pests and instead kills all the natural enemies, and then the pest population just increases, exponentially after that point. So that's really the situation in gardens. In greenhouses and things like that, there's very, very good biological control programs with making planned releases for pests such as the thrips and the whiteflies and the spider mites and things like that. So if you have a greenhouse situation, it'd be really beneficial to you to start looking up, if you're not already practicing biological control, what options are out there. And then finally, the chemical controls. And we kind of put these last because we like to think of them as kind of the last thing that we use in IPM. If the other things that we're doing were not effective, that if our pest population is increasing faster than our biological controls can keep up, the chemical controls are a great option to use. So these are substances for killing, preventing, or repelling pests, and they really should be used along with other IPM methods, and if possible, using chemicals that don't interfere with the other methods that you're using. It's good, when possible, to use the least toxic products. Basically, soap-based insecticides or the oil-based insecticides are less harmful to natural enemies. They basically work on contact. They contact the pest, the insect, and kill it, and then they don't really have any residual activity. But that's kind of the downside, is if you don't get really good coverage, you're very likely to have, aphids or thrips or things like that that did not get killed. So these products are very useful, but because they have so low residual, they're sometimes limited in that way. And of course, you don't spray flowering plants. Spraying flowering plants will kill those beneficial insects, not only pollinating insects, but all the lady beetles and lacewings and things like that. And we'll talk a lot more about the use of chemicals in a separate presentation. So using chemical control indoors, you really want to determine the best method. So for instance, unfortunately with the plants we don't have the baits, but for all our baits, roaches and ants and things like that, baits are a very effective method because they keep the chemical contained and doesn't come in contact with you. So, and you also want to, if you can, determine why insects are indoors, take steps to prevent them. Along with using chemicals, if you're buying house plants, it's important to inspect those plants before you bring them in. If you're bringing in spider mites and some things like that, they can spread to all your house plants. And you want to be really careful applying those chemicals so that you're not exposing pets and children and others to those chemicals. So it's so important, if you're going to use a chemical, to read and follow those labeled directions. So that's the information I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit about IPM and are excited to get outdoors and start to practice some IPM.